The morning started the way it always did at Buckingham Palace, quietly, efficiently, and with a level of controlled tension that the outside world never got to see. Staff moved through the corridors like water around stone, each one knowing their role, their timing, their place. Nothing was ever rushed. Nothing was ever loud. And, yet, on this particular morning, there was something different in the air. A kind of electricity that the more experienced members of staff could feel the moment they stepped into the building. Not panic. Not yet. But the early trembling of something that could very easily become exactly that. The occasion was one of the largest ceremonial events the palace had hosted in nearly 3 years. Dignitaries from across the Commonwealth had been invited. Foreign heads of state were already arriving at Heathrow. Camera crews had been setting up outside the gates since before dawn, their equipment glinting in the thin grey light of an early London morning. The guest list ran to 460 names. The seating arrangements alone had taken a team of 6 coordinators nearly 2 weeks to finalize. Every detail had been considered, confirmed, and cross-checked. Every detail, that is, except for the one that was about to unravel everything. Deep inside the palace's east wing, in the dressing suite reserved for senior members of the royal family, the problem had already begun. It started with a box. Specifically, it started with a very old, very important box that had been delivered to the wrong room. The Greville tiara, one of the most recognizable and historically significant pieces in the entire royal collection, had been scheduled for use by a specific member of the family that morning. The request had been logged, approved, and passed through the proper channels weeks in advance. The jewelry team had prepared it with great care. They had cleaned it, inspected it, and placed it in its original mahogany case with the kind of reverence you might normally reserve for a religious object. And then, through a series of small administrative errors that would later become the subject of a very uncomfortable internal review, it had been sent to the wrong suite entirely. It had been delivered to Camilla. Now, it is important to understand something about Camilla at this point in her life. She was not a woman who particularly enjoyed drama. She had spent enough of her years at the center of public controversy to have developed a very thick skin and a very dry sense of humor about most things. She was pragmatic, warm and private, and genuinely unbothered by many of the ceremonies and formalities that other members of the family took very seriously. But she was also a woman who had, after a long and complicated road, finally arrived at a place of genuine standing within the institution. She had earned her titles, her position, and her role. And, on mornings like this one, when the world was watching and the occasion demanded it, she took the responsibility of dressing the part very seriously indeed. So when the mahogany box arrived at her suite and her dresser opened it to reveal the Greville tiara sitting there on its velvet cushion like it had always belonged to her, Camilla looked at it for a long moment and said nothing. Her dresser, a woman named Margaret who had been working in the palace for 11 years and had seen a great many things, also said nothing. They both looked at the tiara. The tiara, obviously, said nothing either. Then, Camilla said, "Well, it's beautiful, isn't it?" And Margaret, who knew full well that this tiara was not on their approved list for the morning, said, "It is, ma'am." And that was how it began. The confusion was not malicious. That much was clear from the very start. Camilla had no reason to believe the tiara had been sent to her in error. As far as she knew, her jewelry requests for the morning had been confirmed. The fact that this particular piece was not on the list she had personally approved was not something she was immediately aware of, because the administrative error had happened several layers below her direct involvement. She had simply received what she assumed was a confirmed delivery and had proceeded accordingly. By the time the mistake was discovered by the jewelry coordinator, a meticulous young man named David who noticed the error when he went to prepare the confirmed pieces for delivery and found a discrepancy in the log, Camilla's dresser had already begun the process of styling her hair in a way that would accommodate the Greville tiara specifically. The hairpins were in. The base work had been done. The whole look had been built around a piece that, it now turned out, was not supposed to be there at all. David stood in the jewelry room holding his clipboard and feeling the particular kind of dread that only comes when you are the person who has to deliver very bad news to people who are already in the middle of getting ready for something extremely important. He checked the log 3 times. He checked the delivery records twice more. Then, he called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor. That supervisor, a senior palace official named Gerald, went pale in a way that people who work in formal institutions only go pale when the scale of a problem has just become fully apparent to them. He picked up his radio, set it back down, picked it up again, and then made a decision that felt like the right one in the moment and would later be the subject of some debate. He decided to go directly to the source. He went to Camilla's suite. He knocked. He was admitted. He entered to find Camilla seated at her dressing table, her hair partially set, her dresser working quietly and efficiently behind her, and the Greville tiara sitting in its open box on the surface in front of the mirror like it was simply waiting to be placed. Gerald cleared his throat. He explained the situation as calmly and as clearly as he could. He was professional. He was respectful. He chose his words carefully. Camilla looked at him in the mirror for a moment. Then, she looked at the tiara. Then, she looked back at him. "You're telling me," she said, in the measured tone of a woman who has navigated worse situations than this one, "that there's been a mix-up." "I'm afraid so, ma'am. And this piece needs to go somewhere else." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. The dressing room was very still. Outside, somewhere in the palace below them, the distant sounds of an event being set up continued, the clatter of chairs, the murmur of coordinators, the soft thud of flower arrangements being moved into position. The world outside was carrying on exactly as planned. In here, things had become considerably more complicated. "All right," Camilla said finally. "Tell me what you need." It was a reasonable response. A gracious one, even. And if the morning had simply proceeded from that point, if the tiara had been quietly collected and sent on its way and the appropriate replacement had arrived and everyone had simply gotten on with it, then this would have been nothing more than a minor internal incident, forgotten within the week. But the morning did not simply proceed from that point. Because Gerald had barely stepped back into the corridor when he encountered something he had not anticipated. Standing approximately 12 feet away, near the junction where the East Wing corridor met the main residential passage, was one of the palace guards. Not one of the ceremonial guards who stood at the gates for the photographs. This was an interior security officer, part of the team responsible for access to the private residential areas of the palace during high-profile events, when the security protocol was significantly elevated and the rules about who could move where were enforced with a strictness that left very little room for improvisation. The guard's name was Thomas. He was 26 years old. He had been in this role for 14 months. He was, by every account, excellent at his job, thorough, attentive, and deeply committed to following protocol precisely as it had been given to him. He had been briefed that morning, as all interior security staff had been briefed, that during the pre-event preparation period, access to the private suites of the residential East Wing was to be restricted to confirmed, pre-approved personnel only. Any movement of items between suites, particularly items from the royal collection, required written authorization from the event's senior coordinator before it could proceed. Gerald did not have written authorization. He had a clipboard, a radio, and the certain knowledge that a very important piece of jewelry needed to move from one room to another as quickly as possible. But he did not have the specific written clearance that the elevated security protocol required for exactly this kind of situation. Thomas looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Thomas. Between them, unspoken, was the entire complicated machinery of institutional hierarchy, the question of whose authority outranked whose in a situation that the protocol had technically anticipated but that no one had ever actually expected to happen in quite this way. "I need to retrieve an item from this suite," Gerald said. "There's been a scheduling error." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Do you have the transfer authorization from the senior coordinator?" "I don't have the form, no. But I am the senior official for this wing and I'm telling you directly that I understand, sir," Thomas said. And the way he said it made very clear that understanding and compliance were not the same thing. But the protocol for item transfers from residential suites during a restricted access period requires written authorization. I'm not able to make exceptions to that during the elevated security window." Gerald stared at him. Thomas did not move. And, so, for a moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was, the Greville tiara remained exactly where it was, sitting in its mahogany box in Camilla's dressing room, going nowhere, while a senior palace official and a 26-year-old guard stood in a corridor and, politely, professionally, and, with great mutual respect, reached a complete standstill. What happened next was the part that no one had planned for. Not because it was dramatic in an obvious way. Not because anyone raised their voice or made a scene. But, because the person who stepped into that corridor to resolve the situation was someone whose involvement immediately changed every calculation in the room. The door at the far end of the passage opened. Princess Anne walked through it. She was already dressed. She was already composed. She looked, as she almost always looked at these kinds of events, like a woman who had been ready for the last 45 minutes and was only now becoming aware that everyone else had not managed to do the same. She took in the scene in the corridor, Gerald, Thomas, the slightly elevated tension, the body language of two people in a standoff they hadn't expected to be in approximately 2 seconds. She did not ask what was happening. She already knew, in the way that people who have spent decades operating inside complex institutions develop an instinct for reading situations before anyone has spoken a word. She walked toward them. Her heels were precise on the marble floor. Every step was exactly as loud as it needed to be. Gerald began to explain. She listened for about 15 seconds and, then, held up one hand, not rudely, not dismissively, but, with the absolute clarity of a person who has heard enough to understand the full situation and does not need the remaining details right now. She looked at Thomas. Thomas, to his considerable credit, held her gaze. "You're following protocol," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. "Good," she said. And then, she turned to Gerald and said, in a tone that was entirely calm and entirely without ambiguity, "Get the coordinator on the radio and get the form." 2 minutes. Gerald got on his radio. The form, it turned out, took 4 minutes. But no one mentioned that. What mattered was that when it arrived, when the written clearance was transmitted, printed on the small portable device that the coordinator's assistant had rushed up from the ground floor, Thomas accepted it, stepped aside, and the process of resolving the morning's central problem could finally begin. But, by that point, the ripple of the standoff had already spread further than the corridor. Camilla, still in her dressing room, was aware that something had been happening outside her door. Her dresser, Margaret, had said nothing, but had paused once or twice in a way that suggested she was listening. And, down the hall, in the suite where the tiara had originally been intended to go, someone had already been waiting for it for longer than expected, and that waiting had begun to create its own set of complications that no one had yet had the chance to address. The morning was still very early. The event was still hours away. But, the day had already become something other than what anyone had planned. The suite at the far end of the East Wing corridor had its own particular atmosphere that morning, quieter than Camilla's, more spare in its arrangement, and carrying the particular stillness of a room where someone has been waiting without complaint for long enough that the waiting has started to feel like its own kind of statement. Princess Royal's lady-in-waiting, a composed and experienced woman named Helen who had been in royal service for more than 2 decades, had first noticed the absence of the tiara at 7:43 in the morning. She had checked the delivery schedule. She had checked it again. She had quietly contacted the jewelry coordinator's office and received a response that was slightly too slow and slightly too vague for her not to immediately understand that something had gone sideways. By 8 o'clock she had a clearer picture of what had happened, though not yet a full one. By 8:15 she had informed the occupant of the suite. The person waiting in that room for the Greville tiara, the person for whom it had been formally requested, approved, and, prepared, received the information with the particular stillness of someone who has learned, over a very long life in very public circumstances, to process inconvenient information without letting it show on their face. She looked at Helen. Helen looked back at her. Nothing needed to be said. The situation was what it was. "How long?" was all she asked. "We're working on it now, ma'am," Helen said. The answer was not a time. Both of them understood that. Meanwhile, in the corridor, the form had been signed, Thomas had stepped aside, and Gerald was moving back toward Camilla's suite with the slightly too rapid walk of a man who was trying very hard not to actually run. Princess Anne had not left. She had positioned herself at the juncture of the two corridors with the practiced ease of someone who understands that the best way to ensure a problem is resolved is to remain visible until it is. She was not hovering. She was not interfering. She was simply present in the specific, weighted way that senior royals are present when they want things to happen at a certain pace. Camilla, when Gerald returned to her dressing room, had not moved from her seat at the dressing table. She was holding a cup of tea that had almost certainly gone cold. Her dresser Margaret was standing slightly to the side, the stillness of her posture suggesting she had been waiting in exactly that position for some time. The Greville tiara was still in its box. The hairpins that had been styled around it were still in Camilla's hair. The whole careful construction of the morning's look was still built around a centerpiece that was, it turned out, about to leave. Gerald entered and explained the situation in full. This time, the transfer authorization had been secured, the tiara needed to be returned to the jewelry team for immediate transfer to the correct suite, and a replacement piece would be brought to Camilla's room within the next 20 minutes. He was careful and respectful in his delivery. He made clear that the error was entirely an administrative one and that no one had acted improperly. Camilla listened. She set down her cold tea. She looked at the tiara for a moment with an expression that was not quite wistfulness and not quite amusement, but something in between that only someone who knew her well would have been able to name. "Take it," she said simply. Gerald took it. The mahogany box was collected, the jewelry team's representative signed it out, and it was carried down the corridor with a speed that bordered on undignified. Margaret began the process of assessing which of Camilla's approved replacement pieces would work best given the hairwork that had already been completed. The morning continued. But the thing about mornings like this one, big, ceremonial, watched mornings, is that they do not simply continue. They accumulate. Each small delay compounds the ones that came before it. Each improvised solution creates a new variable that the next person down the chain has to absorb and adjust for. By the time the Greville tiara arrived at the correct suite, the event's timeline had shifted by nearly 25 minutes. This was not, in itself, a catastrophe. Schedules at these events were built with buffer. But 25 minutes was enough to create a visible ripple, enough to make coordinators check their watches, enough to make the catering team adjust the timing of the first service, enough to prompt a quiet, urgent conversation between the Lord Chamberlain's office and the event's master of ceremonies about whether certain elements of the pre-event reception needed to be condensed. It was also enough time for word of what had happened in the corridor to begin traveling. Institutions like the palace run on information. Not gossip exactly, or not only gossip, but the constant, necessary flow of knowledge about what is happening, what has happened, and what is likely to happen next. The people who work in these environments develop finely tuned channels for this kind of information. By the time the jewelry team had delivered the tiara to its correct destination and returned to log the transfer, the story of Thomas, the corridor, the authorization form, and Princess Anne's involvement had already reached at least 4 people who had not been present for any of it. The versions varied slightly. In one telling, Princess Anne had reprimanded Gerald. In another, she had praised Thomas. In a third, she had simply sorted everything out in 30 seconds with a single sentence and walked away. None of these versions were entirely accurate. All of them captured something real. Thomas, back at his post and apparently entirely unruffled by the whole experience, was aware that people were looking at him slightly differently than they had been that morning. Not with hostility. More with the particular sidelong attention that gets paid to someone who has done something unexpected and survived it. He had stopped a senior palace official in a restricted corridor during an elevated security preparation period and held his position when challenged, and the person who had ultimately resolved the situation had told him, directly, that he had been right to do it. That kind of thing does not go unnoticed. In the jewelry suite, the coordinator David, who had been the one to discover the original error and triggered the whole chain of events, was in the middle of a very calm, very thorough conversation with his supervisor about how the delivery mislabeling had occurred. He was not being blamed, exactly. But the conversation had the character of a conversation where blame is being carefully distributed, and he was aware that some portion of it would eventually come to rest on the log entries that he had made. He answered every question carefully and completely. He kept his voice steady. He had made a mistake in the chain of communication that had led to the wrong box going to the wrong room, and he knew it, and there was nothing to do now except be completely honest about it and let the institution decide what that meant. What it meant, as it turned out, was a new verification procedure that would be implemented before the next major event, a second sign-off requirement for any delivery to a residential suite during a pre-event preparation window. The procedure would be named, informally and without any official documentation, the double-check protocol. David would be the one who drafted it. This was, in its quiet way, a kind of institutional grace, the person who had caused the problem being given the opportunity to be part of fixing it. Upstairs, in the correct suite, the Greville tiara had finally arrived. Helen received it with the composure of someone who had been waiting long enough that the relief of its arrival had already burned off, and what remained was simply the practical business of getting on with things. The jewelry team's representative opened the box. The tiara was inspected. It was confirmed intact, undamaged, exactly as it should have been. The woman who was to wear it looked at it for a moment. She had been patient through the wait. She had asked no further questions after the first one. She had simply sat, and composed herself, and trusted that the institution she had given her life to would eventually sort itself out. As it always did. She allowed Helen to place the tiara. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long, quiet moment. "It'll do," she said. Helen, who had heard this phrase many times before and knew exactly what weight it carried, allowed herself a very small smile. In Camilla's suite, Margaret had made her decision about the replacement piece, a diamond and pearl bandeau that worked beautifully with the hairwork already in place and was, in the opinion of several people who saw her that day, arguably more striking than the Greville would have been. Camilla, when it was placed, tilted her head slightly to one side and studied herself in the mirror with the practical assessment of someone who has long since stopped finding the ceremony of these moments either intimidating or glamorous and simply treats them as part of the job. "That works," she said. Margaret agreed that it did. By the time Princess Anne left the East Wing corridor and returned to her own preparations, the immediate crisis had resolved. The tiara was where it was supposed to be. The timeline was compressed but manageable. The guard had followed protocol and been vindicated for it. The senior official had secured the necessary authorization and completed the transfer. The replacements had been confirmed, the hairwork adjusted, the event machinery recalibrated. But there was still the matter of the public element. The 460 guests who would be arriving within the next 2 hours. The cameras outside the gate. The coverage that would follow every movement of every member of the family from the moment they stepped into view. The inevitable commentary, the frame-by-frame scrutiny of who wore what and why and what it might mean, the layer of external interpretation that the palace could never fully control no matter how carefully it managed everything else. On a morning when a very specific and very significant piece of jewelry had almost ended up in an unintended place, the question of what the public would see and what story they would make of it was not a small one. The palace's communications team was already aware that something had happened that morning. They did not know all the details, those were still being assembled and would continue to be assembled for the rest of the day. But they knew enough to understand that the visual record of the event would be examined closely and that the question of who was wearing what would generate coverage regardless of what they did. Jewelry at royal events is never simply jewelry. It is lineage, and statement, and precedent, and claim. Every tiara has a history. Every choice carries weight that extends far beyond the aesthetic. What they could not know yet, what none of the people involved in the morning's internal scramble could fully appreciate from inside it, was how the external narrative would form around the images that would emerge from the day. How the photographs taken by the accredited photographers outside the palace gates would be examined and analyzed. How a particular moment, the way two women held themselves, the pieces they wore, the very slight shift in expression that a good lens could catch if it was pointed at the right angle at the right second, would be clipped and captioned and circulated in a way that made the morning's internal chaos look, from the outside, like an entirely different kind of story. The event had not yet begun. the guests had not yet arrived. The family had not yet made their public appearances. But the shape of the day was already set. The decisions made in those corridors, in those dressing rooms, by a guard with a clipboard and a princess with a deadline and 2 women looking at tiaras in their mirrors, all of it was already moving toward a moment that the outside world would be watching very carefully. And, somewhere in the palace, in a room that the cameras would never see, a young guard named Thomas was standing at his post, doing his job, and thinking absolutely nothing about any of it. Which was exactly as it should have been. The hour before these events was always the strangest one. The palace had a particular quality during it, a hell-breath quality, a compression of energy that you could feel in the temperature of the corridors and the pace of the footsteps and the way the staff communicated in shorter, more economical words than usual. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Everything that could be confirmed had been confirmed. Now the only thing left to do was to wait for the moment when the doors opened and the performance began and all the internal complexity of the morning disappeared behind the smooth, practiced surface of a royal occasion proceeding exactly as planned. That surface would be convincing. It always was. That was the point of all of it, the protocols, the checklists, the authorization forms, the corridor standoffs, the authorization forms obtained under pressure, the cold tea, the replacement tiaras, the very small smile from a lady-in-waiting who had seen everything before and trusted the institution to sort itself out. The surface would hold. It always did. What was underneath it, the particular shape of that specific morning, the specific people who had moved through it and the choices they had made would remain, as these things always remained, invisible to the world watching from outside. Except that this time, as it would turn out, not entirely of the doors opened at 10:23. The first guests began arriving in the forecourt at 10:31. By 11 o'clock the reception rooms were filling with the particular sound that large, formally dressed gatherings of important people make, a sound that is somehow both louder and more muted than ordinary conversation, as though everyone has collectively agreed to turn their volume up slightly while simultaneously taking the edge off anything too sharp or too direct. Laughter, but careful laughter. Greetings, but measured ones. The constant soft percussion of glasses being lifted and set down, of heels on polished floors, of the quiet organizational murmur of palace staff moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people who have spent years learning how to be in a room without being seen to be in it. The family entered through the grand corridor at 11:15. They entered as they always entered at these occasions, composed, unhurried, dressed with the particular precision that transforms clothing into communication. The photographers outside the gates had already captured the arrivals of the guests. The official palace photographers were positioned inside. The cameras were everywhere, as they always were, and the members of the royal family moved through their field of vision with the ease of people who have never known a life without being looked at. What the cameras captured that morning, among many other things, was this: 2 women, at 2 separate moments of their entrance, wearing 2 different pieces of jewelry. Both stunning. Both historically significant. Both, in their own way, perfectly chosen for the occasion and the person wearing them. To anyone watching who did not know what had happened that morning in the East Wing corridor, the visual record told a seamless story, a perfectly coordinated royal event, every detail considered and deliberate, the kind of effortless institutional performance that the palace had been perfecting for centuries. To anyone who did know, and, by this point, the number of people inside the palace who knew at least the broad outlines of the morning's events had grown considerably, the same images told a very different story. A story about a box delivered to the wrong room, an authorization form obtained under pressure in a marble corridor, a young guard who had held his position when it would have been much easier not to, and a senior princess who had walked into a standoff and resolved it in 4 minutes. Both stories were true. That was the interesting thing about it. The seamless surface and the complicated interior were not in contradiction. They were the same event, viewed from different distances. The reception proceeded. The speeches were given. The introductions were made. The 460 guests moved through the rooms and the afternoon with the collective grace of people who have accepted the terms of a formal occasion and are genuinely enjoying it within those terms. The catering was excellent. The flowers were remarkable. The music, provided by a chamber ensemble positioned in the East Gallery, was precisely appropriate, present enough to fill the silence but never insistent enough to compete with conversation. In the middle of all of this, at some point during the second hour of the reception, Princess Anne was approached by a Commonwealth official she had known for many years, a sharp and well-informed man named Geoffrey who had a talent for sensing when something interesting had happened and an equal talent for asking about it in a way that felt more like friendly conversation than interrogation. "You look like someone who had an eventful morning," Geoffrey said. Princess Anne looked at him over the rim of her glass with the expression of someone who was deciding, in real time, how much of an answer this question deserves. "Every morning is eventful," she said. Geoffrey smiled. "I heard there was some trouble with a piece of jewelry." "Jewelry is always trouble," she said. And that was the end of that conversation. It was not, however, the end of the story. Because alongside the official proceedings of the day, alongside the photographs and the speeches and the handshakes and the carefully managed public record of a royal occasion going exactly as planned, another layer of the morning was quietly making its way through the channels by which these things travel. Not the press, not yet. The palace's communications operation was professional and thorough, and the details of an internal administrative error were exactly the kind of thing it was good at keeping contained. But the human network, the staff who had been there, the coordinators who had spoken to other coordinators, the people whose jobs required them to understand what had happened so they could make sure it didn't happen again, that network had its own momentum. By the following morning, a version of the story had reached a royal correspondent at one of the larger British newspapers. The correspondent, a thorough and careful journalist named Rachel who had been covering the palace for 8 years, had heard enough partial accounts of palace logistics incidents to know how to evaluate what she was hearing. She made 3 calls. She received 2 confirmations and 1 non-denial that functioned, in her professional experience, as a confirmation. She had a story. The question was what kind of story it was. This is where things became interesting in a way that no one inside the palace had fully anticipated when the morning had first begun to go sideways. Because the story that Rachel was putting together, the story of a guard stopping Camilla, of a standoff in a corridor, of Princess Anne stepping in, was not obviously a damaging story. It was not the kind of story that made anyone look catastrophically bad. The administrative error had been resolved. The event had proceeded without visible disruption. No one had behaved in a way that was genuinely inappropriate. Thomas had done his job correctly. Gerald had secured the proper authorization. Princess Anne had intervened efficiently and without drama. Camilla had released the tiara gracefully. The whole morning, from a purely functional standpoint, had worked. But stories about the royal family are never purely functional. They are always about something more than the facts they contain. And the facts this particular story contained: a guard physically preventing Camilla from retaining a significant piece of jewelry, a corridor standoff, a princess taking control of a situation that had gotten away from the people nominally in charge of it. Those facts, in the hands of a skilled journalist with 8 years of context for what they meant, pointed toward questions that went considerably beyond the logistics of a single morning. Questions about hierarchy. About authority. About who, in the complicated internal architecture of the modern royal family, has the kind of standing that makes a guard hold his position and makes a senior official back down and makes a princess's presence instantly change the weight of every calculation in the room. Rachel wrote her story carefully. She was scrupulous about the facts she had confirmed. She was equally scrupulous about what she did not know and could not verify. The piece that ran 3 days after the event was measured, precise, and, in the particular way of good journalism about institutions, more interesting for what it implied than for what it stated directly. The headline focused on the guard and the standoff. The body of the piece was really about something else entirely. Inside the palace, the reaction to the piece was the particular combination of irritation and resigned recognition that a well-sourced story about an internal matter tends to produce in institutions that prize their privacy. The communications team issued a brief statement confirming that the event had taken place, that a logistical matter had been efficiently resolved on the day, and that the tiara in question, the Greville, was a significant piece in the royal collection and had been worn at the appropriate occasion as intended. The statement did not mention Thomas by name. It did not mention Gerald or David or Margaret. It did not mention the authorization form or the elevated security protocol or the 4 minutes between Princess Anne's arrival in the corridor and the form being received. It did not need to. Rachel's piece already had all of that. Thomas, when someone eventually sent him a link to the article, read it once. He read the part about himself, a single paragraph, accurate in its facts, that described a guard holding a protocol position under pressure from a senior official before the situation was resolved by a member of the royal family. He set his phone down. He picked it up again and reread the paragraph. He thought about whether there was anything in it that was wrong. He decided there wasn't. He set the phone down again and went back to work. The coverage generated by Rachel's piece ran for approximately 4 days before the news cycle absorbed it and moved on. Several other outlets picked up the story. Some of the versions that circulated online were less careful with the facts than the original. In one viral summary, Thomas had physically blocked Camilla from leaving her suite. In another, Princess Anne had arrived in full ceremonial dress and delivered a speech about protocol. Neither of these things had happened. The story, like all stories that pass through too many hands, had been simplified and sharpened until the messy human reality at its center, the cold tea, the hairpins already in, the mahogany box, the young man with a clipboard trying to do his job right, had been replaced with something cleaner and more legible. But the original story was still there, for anyone who went back to read it. The real one, with its real details. A morning in which a small administrative error had cascaded through an institution, touching everyone it reached and leaving each of them slightly changed, a young guard whose reputation had quietly shifted, a coordinator who would spend the next 6 months writing a new verification procedure, a senior official who had learned something about the value of having the right form at the right moment, a lady-in-waiting who had waited patiently and been rewarded for it, a woman who had looked at a tiara that was not hers and said simply, "Take it." Institutions survive because of the people who take the small things seriously. The forms, the protocols, the authorization procedures that seem bureaucratic and excessive until the morning when something goes wrong and they turn out to be exactly the right tool for exactly this problem. Thomas had not been a hero that morning, in any grand sense of the word. He had not prevented a catastrophe. He had not protected anyone from harm. He had simply done what he had been trained to do, in a situation where the easier thing would have been to make an exception and wave the problem through. That is, in its quiet way, the hardest thing. Not the big decisions, made under visible pressure with everyone watching. The small ones, made in corridors, with no audience except a senior official who wants you to step aside and a radio that hasn't responded yet and a form that hasn't arrived and the certain knowledge that you are in the right and will remain in the right only as long as you don't blink. Thomas had not blinked. Princess Anne, who had seen many people blink over the course of a very long career in a very scrutinized institution, had noticed. Her assessment of the situation, the 3 words she had said to him directly, the way she had then turned and handled the rest of it, was not a small thing. It was the kind of specific, witnessed acknowledgement that moves through an institution and settles into a person's record in ways that are never formally documented but are always, somehow, remembered. In the weeks after the event, as the coverage faded and the internal review reached its conclusions and the double-check protocol was drafted and approved and quietly circulated to the relevant teams, the morning of the Greville Tiara Standoff took its place among the many other mornings that the people involved in it would carry with them in the particular way you carry things that tested you and that you came through intact. For Camilla, it was a morning that had required grace under an inconvenience, and she had given it without being asked. That was not nothing. For the woman who had waited, patiently and without complaint, for the tiara that was hers, who had looked in the mirror when it finally arrived and said the 4 words that encompassed an entire lifetime of measured public composure, it was a morning that had simply confirmed what she had always known about institutions. They are slow and complicated, and sometimes they make mistakes. But if you have been part of them long enough, you learn to trust that the machinery will sort itself out. You learn to wait. For Princess Anne, it was probably barely a morning at all. It was a corridor situation she had encountered on her way somewhere else, resolved in the way these things are resolved efficiently, without drama, by understanding exactly what the situation required, and then moved on from. She had done what needed to be done. The event had proceeded. The guest list had been hosted, the speeches had been given, the tiara had been worn by the person it was meant for. Everything had worked out. It always did. That was the part that the outside world never quite grasped, watching from behind the gates with cameras and questions and their own interpretations of the meaning of jewelry and hierarchy, and whose expression seemed slightly different from usual. The palace's ability to absorb disruption, correct its errors, and present an unbroken surface to the world was not a deception. It was a skill accumulated over generations, maintained by thousands of people doing small jobs correctly, held together by the consistent application of protocols that had been designed precisely for the moments when things went wrong. The guard at the corridor had been part of that. The form he had required, and waited for, and accepted when it came, that had been part of it too. The cold tea and the hairpins and the mahogany box and the 4 minutes and the single sentence from a princess who had seen enough to know what she was looking at. All of it, together, had made the surface hold. The Greville tiara gleamed under the lights of the palace reception room. 460 guests moved through the afternoon, lifted their glasses, made their toasts, and carried away their particular memories of a beautifully managed royal occasion. The cameras outside captured what they could see. The photographers inside captured what was shown to them. And, somewhere in the East Wing, in the quiet after the guests had gone and the coordinators had begun the long business of wrapping up the day, a coordinator named David sat at a desk and opened a new document on his laptop and began to write the first draft of a procedure that would ensure that what had happened that morning would never quite happen the same way again. He gave it a title. He made it clear and simple. He thought about all the places where the chain had broken down and built in checks for each of them. He was thorough. He was methodical. He was, in the way that the best institutional work always is, quietly and completely invisible to the world it protected. He saved the document. He read it through once. He made 3 small changes. Then, he closed his laptop, turned off his desk lamp, and went home. The palace was quiet. The day was done. The tiara was back in its box.